There are a staggering amount of video games in development at this very moment. The video game development process is usually a long one and can span many years. During this time, many developers will hit obstacles and roadblocks that impede their progress. Some may recover, but others may simply give up. This is the harsh reality of video game development. Regardless of the lifespan of a console, every console has its fair share of cancelled games. This is especially true of Sega's final console, the Dreamcast. Its relatively short life meant that it had more than its fair share of cancelled games. Let us take a further look at what the future had in store for Sega's little gray box. This is episode 8 of The Games That Never Were. Hellgate, developed by Horny Dog, was a vehicular shooter that began development in 1999. The game was intended as a Dreamcast exclusive and likely would have been released fairly late in the console's life. The story of the game revolves around a biker named Marv who's the leader of the Nevada chapter of the Hells Angels. One night while out cruising with other members of the club, they're attacked by a group of demons claiming to be the real Hells Angels from Hades itself. Everyone is brutally beaten and killed with the exception of Marv, who is left alive for unknown reasons. During the attack, Marv manages to kill one of the demons, steal his bike, and follow the rest of the group into the gates of hell. Unbeknownst to Marv, he's become part of a plan to open up the gates of hell and bring about the end of the earth. The gameplay in Hellgate has the player assume the role of Marv as he cycles his way through the fire and brimstone, killing every demon he sees along the way. Luckily, the motorcycle acquired from the original slain demon provides plenty of onboard firepower. You'll have everything from machine guns and rocket launchers to deadly icicles and fireballs to annihilate your enemies with. The developers described Hellgate's gameplay as combining the speed of Wipeout with the weaponry of Quake. Horny Dog put a big emphasis on the game being as fast as possible with precise controls so you could take turns and avoid obstacles quickly. Not only would the game have a deep single-player campaign, but the developers also planned to include local and online multiplayer. The multiplayer modes were to include things such as Deathmatch, Capture the Flag, Time Trials, and a mode called Sumo. Horny Dog claimed Hellgate would be the first Dreamcast game to support 12 players at once when playing online. Hellgate was in development for 15 months before the project was scrapped. The reason for the cancellation was a combination of some of the developers not being fully dedicated to the project and Sega's announcement that they were exiting the hardware business. The latter was likely the nail in the coffin for Hellgate. In March of 2009, an unfinished beta of the game was found on a Dreamcast development kit and released online. Emergency Call Ambulance by Sega was an arcade driving game that was first released in the arcades in 1999. The game was intended to be ported to the Dreamcast in the form of a compilation disc that would consist of 3 different Sega arcade games. As you might expect by the title, Emergency Call Ambulance has you taking the role of an ambulance driver. Your job is to transport injured civilians from the scene of an accident or crime to the nearest hospital. This isn't as straightforward as you might think though, as you'll have to avoid traffic and other obstacles that get in your way. Unlike in real life, other vehicles won't simply move to the side of the road when they see you coming. Making things even more challenging is the requirement to monitor the patient's condition and heart rate at all times. The patient's condition will steadily decrease over time, and hitting any obstacle will seriously worsen their condition, possibly sending them into respiratory arrest. If the patient dies before reaching the hospital, you've failed your mission and it's game over. The game consists of 4 different missions, ranging from a simple traffic accident to a presidential plane crash. Each mission will ramp up the difficulty and make getting to your destination a much trickier task. Not only will you have to contend with the ever-present traffic, but you'll also have vehicles crashing around you, blocked off roads, and even terrorists firing bazookas at you. By the final mission, the city will practically be falling down around you. As with many similar arcade games such as Crazy Taxi and 18-Wheeler, memorizing your route and finding all the shortcuts will be critical to success. Emergency Call Ambulance surely would have been a great addition to the Dreamcast library, and would have fit in very well with the many other excellent arcade ports on the system. Sadly, it was never meant to be. The UK's official Dreamcast magazine reported that the game was headed to the Dreamcast as part of a compilation called Real Life Careers. Sega of America reportedly denied the game was being ported to the Dreamcast, so it was possible it was to be a PAL exclusive. Either way, it doesn't seem like there was much progress made on the port. The game was never ported to any home console, so it remains an arcade exclusive to this day. Streets of Rage 4 by Sega was to be the fourth installment in the popular side-scrolling beat-em-up franchise that began on their fourth-generation console. A new installment in the series had been attempted several times before the Dreamcast iteration. The earliest attempt at Streets of Rage 4 was called Streets of Rage 3D and was headed to Sega's 32-bit Saturn console. Rather than developing the game from the ground up, Sega was in talks with Core Design to use their half-completed Fighting Force game. Negotiations eventually fell apart, however, with Core Design wanting to release the game on multiple platforms and Sega wanting to keep it a Saturn exclusive. Another attempt was made shortly after, with a game that was eventually released as Die Hard Arcade. The Dreamcast version of Streets of Rage 4 was initially shown off as an on-stage tech demo early in the console's life. This tech demo showed the game's main protagonist, Axel, fighting various enemies from both the classic side-scrolling perspective and a new first-person perspective. Another new feature to the game was called Team Attack, where two players could work together to pull off a more powerful move. Not much else is known about the Dreamcast version of the game. It's suspected the game was scrapped shortly after showing off the tech demo. Sega was going through some management changes at the time, and some of the new staff were unaware of the franchise's previous success. They believed the game wouldn't be successful due to the dwindling popularity of the beat-em-up genre. This marked the end of Streets of Rage 4 on the Dreamcast. Sega did eventually consider working on the game again for release on Microsoft's Xbox, but nothing ever came of it. Acolyte by Revenant was an action-adventure game that started development around 1997. Initially, the game was just headed to PC, but a Dreamcast version was reportedly in the works. The story of the game is heavily based on Greek, Egyptian, Norse, and Chinese mythology, and revolves around a secret society named the Order of the Mystics, who are tasked with observing the gods and keeping a record of their activity. Over time, the gods have slowly disappeared from existence, and the ones that remain are in a weakened state due to having far fewer followers than in centuries past. The evil gods see this as an opportunity to wipe out what remains of the good gods. This begins when Loki, the son of Odin from Greek mythology, escapes his prison and murders his father. As part of the Order of the Mystics, it's your job not to destroy the evil gods, but to make sure the universe remains balanced, with equal parts good and evil. The gameplay in Acolyte was to be very similar to Quake in terms of its control scheme, but with an emphasis on melee combat as well as magic. The game was also to have RPG elements, with your character gaining experience as you progressed. Exploration was to be a big part of Acolyte, which included a breathtaking world filled with fantastical creatures, gods, humans, and many things to find. While the game was to be very action-oriented, players interested in the story could reveal more of it by exploring every inch of the world. You would have very few limits as to where you could travel in the game, from the home of the humans known as the Core Plane, to the awe-inspiring realm of the gods. Revenant was trying to take elements from many different genres, including the RPG, first-person shooter, and point-and-click adventure, all backed up by an epic storyline. It was a very ambitious endeavor, with developers going as far as spending 2 years just researching the mythology for the storyline. The game's engine was built from the ground up and even had been completely redone at one point because they felt it wasn't performing well enough. So what exactly happened to Acolyte? No one really knows. The game seems to have just disappeared without a trace. Other than a few articles and some screenshots, there really are no clues as to what happened. Revenant was a very small studio with only 2 programmers, so it's very possible they went bust and weren't able to finish the game. Drones by Nigma Software was a fighting game that first started development in November of 1997. The game was intended as a Dreamcast launch title. Based on the 1983 Discs of Tron arcade game by Bally Midway, Drones takes place in the near future, with contestants fighting in a virtual combat arena for the title of World Champion. Unlike most fighting games, however, combat would not be hand-to-hand, but rather from a distance using thrown projectiles. These projectiles could be thrown either directly at players or bounced off walls or ceilings. You could even shoot the ceiling above the player and hurt them with falling debris. The arenas aren't exactly typical either, with players standing on floating circular platforms that they can freely jump between. Each stage would differ in the amount of platforms and also have different hazards to avoid, such as booby traps, turrets, and big boss enemies. One of the most unique features of Drones is the ability to intelligently create a clone of the player called a drone based on how they play the game. As you play, the game will study your movement, weapon preferences, and behavior so that it can create this clone. Once the game has created this computer-controlled copy of you, you can literally play the game against yourself. This same feature would essentially allow you to create an endless variety of CPU players by having your friends and family play the game as well. Drones was to be a very multiplayer-focused game, and was to include both local and online multiplayer modes. In the online mode, you could compete with not only other Dreamcast players, but also PC players and even players using the arcade version of the game. Enigma Software stated in a 1998 issue of Sega Saturn magazine that the arcade version of Drones was likely to be completed by the end of the year, and even said the Dreamcast version would be completed well before the European Dreamcast launch. Unfortunately, it seems that Enigma Software encountered difficulties as they never released the game and seem to have completely disappeared. The rights to the game were eventually passed to French developer Zitha Games, who released the game initially as a tech demo for Nvidia's GeForce 3 line of PC graphics chips. The game eventually did make its way to console in the form of Denu Tyson Drones on the original Xbox in 2004, but it was released only in Japan. As with most games that change developers, it seems the final game didn't retain a lot of the features touted by the original developer. Video game development is without a doubt a rocky road wrought with many challenges and obstacles. Whether it be internal conflicts between team members or the sudden loss of the platform your game was headed to, there are many things that may hinder a game's progress. Many of these challenges can easily be overcome by larger development studios, but can be devastating to a small team of developers. There isn't always a reason given for why a game is cancelled. Some games are never officially cancelled and just fade away into obscurity. Whatever the reason may be, at least there are some remnants left over for us to see, and in some cases play. And that concludes this episode of The Games That Never Were, and until next time, thanks for watching.